World regions, geography, Middle East and North Africa. We're going to continue on geological resources, risks, and water. We're in the middle of talking about, this is part two. We were in the middle of talking about Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. Most of you have heard of OPEC. OPEC is the group of countries, oil-producing countries, that have tried to control the global market and global price of petroleum. They came together in the early 1960s and really became a real political force in the 1970s. Most of you are too young to remember, but in 1973, OPEC decided to embargo oil to the United States and Western Europe because of their support for Israel in the recently concluded war with Israel, which they lost, and that threw the world economies into a tailspin. Geographies and indulgence, desire, and addiction. Luxury cars such as Bentley saw a rise in sales driven by high demand in the Middle East. Dubai has the highest ratio of cars to people in the world. Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain. The region is home to many high-end Formula One races. That's the Dubai race there, I think a picture of it. Deforestation, the ecology, land, and environmental management. Deforestation in Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, and Iran. And the extinctions of leopards, crocodiles, oryx, cheetahs, and lions. A lot of us don't really think about these species. I mean, we may think about Nile crocodiles having existed, but we don't realize there was an Asian leopard, the oryx, which is a deer type or animal. You know, it's a large herbivore. Cheetahs, there were Asian cheetahs. There still are a few left, and there are still some Asian lions left. But they were once pretty extensive. If you've read the Bible, you've heard the story of Daniel in the lion's den in Babylon. These species were driven to extinction over years of hunting and just extermination. Desertification is that process of which the desert increases its extent. So it's causes for changing in the flora, which is the type of plants in an area, and it has to do with climate change, and also by it's impacted by man's use, and a lot of times what happens is they're diverting water for agricultural purposes, and this causes desertification in another area. And afforestation is the active attempt by certain countries in the region, Iran, Dubai, to try to create green belts to hold back desertification. So to try to reclaim some of the desert by planting trees in particular. History, economy, and tradition. The domestication of plants and animals about 10 to 12,000 years ago, and the creation of semi-permanent settlements. Up until that time, basically they were hunters and gatherers. And the region you've probably heard of is the Fertile Crescent, which is this region right here. It's through the Tigris-Euphrates Valley and up through Syria, and then along the Mediterranean coast through Lebanon and Israel. And this area is where domestication of plants and animals and the first cities started to develop. As people shifted from a herding pastoral lifestyle to cities, then you had small groups of people, fishermen and farmers in these regions, which raised the food, and this allowed them to support all of these other functions in society, such as priests, government, military, uh, shopkeepers, merchants, those sorts of things could be supported by the growing number of farmers and fishers because they were much more productive. And this allowed for the establishment of cities, and then those cities in turn allowed for things like mathematics, writing, poetry, laws, government to be established. The Fertile Crescent is an early plant and animal domestication. Wet farming. What we refer to wet farming is the use of agriculture, or excuse me, the use of irrigation to farm land. So basically, they began to increase production of grasses, and grasses, sometimes we don't think of grasses, but things like rice and wheat and barley are all types of grasses, and they would harvest the seeds of those grasses, and they would be able to get enough nutrition and store those over long periods of time, and this would allow them to eat during the year when there was nothing growing. When it was growing, it wasn't being harvested. And it gave rise to hydraulic civilizations. And basically, what these are is civilizations that used agriculture, and they used irrigation as a way to maintain the civilization through irrigating in their agriculture. This Middle East region, this Fertile Crescent region, is the birthplace of three major world religions, and they're all have fairly common basis: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And even though a lot of times we think that they're constantly fighting each other, they all have kind of the same basis and the same basic tenets, um, with a few little differences. Urbanization, which is that creation of cities, the ability to start to have cities, particularly in the Fertile Crescent, they tended to be walled because there was a lot of access. You had warring groups trying to get control of regions, and so they would build walls to be able to protect the city. And this is the primary urbanization. These uh, these first beginnings of forming towns with residential areas and commercial areas and government areas. And then the secondary urbanization is a much larger cities with temples and extensive military areas, um, much larger. The small primary urbanization was tended to be 7 to 25,000. Secondary cities were quite a bit bigger. And then you have Islamic cities in this region, and these are really, depending on where they're at, they copied the local architectural style or architectural design style. In other words, the layout of the city, whether it's Greek or Roman or Persian. Then they would take that and they would add Islamic architecture to it as opposed to none. And what you see there is a cuneiform tablet with cuneiform writing on it. And this is, I think, the Great Mosque in Jerusalem. The Ottoman Empire, you had the rise of the Arab empires in this region starting in about the 6th, 7th century, and the spread of Islam into all of this region and across North Africa and actually up into Spain, and they crossed over into France and were defeated in 732 by Charles Martel and then retreated back into Spain. But you have the rise in the 11th century of the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottomans were a group that came out of this region up in here in Central Asia, the Transcaucasus regions, and came down into Turkey and conquered Turkey, uh, conquered part of the Balkans. Um, you began to see these nationalist movements rising. In other words, like the Saudi, the Egyptians, the Iraqi region, Algerians, Libyans, wanting to have their own local government outside of Ottoman control. And then after World War I, you saw the rise of the mandates, and the mandates were the Europeans' decision to, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War, they established these mandates, which were British mandates, French mandates, and it was who was governing where along here. The Italians got Libya, the French got Algeria, Spanish got this region, British got this region through here, and these regions here were left independent: Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. So what do we mean by the Middle East? Now, a lot of times people nowadays, particularly people in this region, don't like it to call it the Middle East. The Middle East is actually a term that was given to the region um, by an American admiral who named it the Middle East, and then the British, because the Far East was over here in China, in India, this was the middle, and so it's kind of a colonial term, and that's why there's some resentment about that in the region. The economy, accumulation, and production of inequality. Import substitution. So some countries have tried that, and import substitution just simply means that the particular government attempts to subsidize local production by creating tariffs on imported goods that they can produce locally. Quite often in import substitution, what you see is that you have low quality, high price, and so they usually have not been successful. Nationalization. Nationalization is a program where these governments, Algeria, Libya, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, all nationalized various industries, primarily petroleum industry, but also other industries. You saw it more recently in Venezuela. They've attempted to control their economy by nationalizing all the industries, and now they're virtually on the verge of collapse. You have a rural to urban migration. In other words, people are moving out of the rural areas into the urban areas. There's often not jobs, so they end up in what's called an informal economy. They're running a little shop here. They're not paying any taxes. It's not considered part of the GDP, but it is supporting them and providing for their families. And you have oil states, and these were created by the oil dependent. So they're dependent on oil exports. They have petrodollars, some of them Saudi Arabia, Dubai, those countries. It's a certain small percent of the population is very wealthy. Some of the governments have spent a lot of money on their people, but they really have not developed the economy. And in a minute, we're going to see the employment numbers, and you will see that it is pretty horrific. Economic diversification. They're just starting to economically diversify from oil dependence, because this region's trying to do some agriculture. They're trying to do finance in this region, but so far it has not been enough to create any extensive non-governmental job market.